Marcus had fought for justice all his life, but he never imagined that one day he himself would be accused of a crime he didn't commit, and that his very fight against racism would become the reason for this accusation. The most shocking thing wasn't that he was framed, but how he chose to respond. His actions changed everything. But let's start from the moment when his life turned upside down. Marcus anxiously looked out the taxi window, observing the city that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. New York was a symbol of progress, success, and international recognition. He had come here to present his discoveries in cardiac surgery, which could save thousands of lives worldwide. But deep inside, beneath the layers of confidence and professional stature, he felt an odd unease. He knew that despite his achievements, the color of his skin still played a role in the eyes of many. And this worry simmered, like embers that could ignite at any moment. As the taxi approached the conference hall, Marcus felt a surge of pride. His research, years of hard work, had finally been recognized by the global medical community. He stepped out of the car, carrying a case with materials for his presentation, and headed toward the entrance. Around him, life bustled. People were rushing, talking on the phone, busy with their own concerns. No one paid him any attention. That's for the best, Marcus thought. He wanted to focus on his upcoming lecture. But as soon as he left the conference hall, his world suddenly changed. A police patrol, stationed nearby, caught his eye. "Excuse me, sir, could you come with us?" one of them asked. Marcus froze, not understanding what was happening. "Is something wrong?" he asked, trying to stay calm, though inside his anxiety was already growing. "We received a report of a theft, and you fit the description of the suspect," the officer replied, not hiding the suspicion in his gaze. Marcus's thoughts raced like flashes of lightning. He, a black surgeon with international recognition, had suddenly become a suspect. Marcus couldn't believe his ears. "This must be a misunderstanding," he began, but his words seemed to bounce off the officers. At that moment, he realized that his status and his accomplishments meant nothing when his race was the first thing they saw. Standing on the sidewalk in front of the conference hall, surrounded by police officers, Marcus could feel the stares of passers-by and colleagues who had begun to stop and watch. Inside, he boiled with rage, but outwardly he tried to remain composed. This was the moment he understood. All his efforts, years of education and hard work, could not protect him from the fact that society still saw him primarily as a black man. "I have identification. I'm Dr. Marcus Davis. I'm here for an international conference," he said, trying to explain the situation to the officers. "We have witness statements," one of the officers responded coldly. "We can't let you go until we sort this out." Each word from the officer struck Marcus's pride like a hammer. He looked at the people who had gathered, listening to their whispers. Some seemed to have already passed judgment. He saw doubt in their eyes. Could someone as successful and educated as he be involved in a crime? These thoughts tore him apart. The internal conflict grew. How do you maintain your dignity when you're humiliated in front of everyone? And how do you fight back without bursting into anger? His heart pounded with hurt and helplessness. He couldn't afford to lose control, but it was becoming harder and harder to hold back. Marcus saw colleagues turning away, pretending not to notice him, unwilling to get involved in an uncomfortable situation. "Do you really think I'm involved in this?" he asked quietly, with restrained anger, looking directly into the officer's eyes. "We're just doing our jobs, sir," the officer replied, unfazed. But behind those words, Marcus only heard, "You're a suspect because you're black." Soon, the real culprit was apprehended, and the officers came up to Marcus with apologies. "It was a misunderstanding," one of them mumbled, avoiding eye contact. But what had changed? Apologies couldn't erase the humiliation he had just endured. The word misunderstanding felt like mockery. To you, it's just a mistake, but to me, it's yet another reminder that my life, my achievements, mean nothing to you, Marcus thought as he watched the officers retreat. The crowd began to disperse. Colleagues who had been watching now avoided his gaze, unsure of what to say. But Marcus no longer needed their support. He realized that systemic racism was not just an accident. It was a deep problem that destroys lives, even when you've reached the pinnacle of success. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to find calm in the chaos of his thoughts. I have to do something, crossed his mind. He couldn't just walk away and forget about the incident. He had to act. But how? Where do you start when fighting a system so deeply ingrained with bias and injustice? When he returned to his hotel, his thoughts wouldn't leave him. Every word from the officer, every pair of eyes that had looked at him with suspicion, reminded him that he had to make a choice. Accept it or start fighting. Marcus could no longer remain a passive observer in a world where his achievements meant nothing in the face of racial stereotypes. He was determined to fight for justice, and the first step began with himself. Marcus sat in the dimly lit hotel room, his hands resting on his knees. Outside, the hum of New York could be heard, but he was too absorbed in his own thoughts to notice. His mind was paralyzed by recent events, which seemed to blur the lines between past and present. Faces of the police officers, their cold, impenetrable looks, as if he were not a person but just another problem to solve, kept resurfacing in his mind. Why did this happen to me? This question gnawed at him. He knew it wasn't the first time. He knew that his black skin had always been a target, but each time it hit differently, with new force. As a boy in a small southern town, he had faced prejudice daily. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" teachers would ask, smiling skeptically when he proudly said he wanted to become a doctor. For them, it was an unrealistic scenario for a black boy. Now, he had achieved his goal, becoming a successful surgeon, but it all seemed meaningless when his face, his skin color, became a barrier to acknowledging his accomplishments. All his achievements could disappear in a split second as soon as someone suspected him of a crime. Marcus felt tension growing inside him, like a spring wound too tight. His gaze fell accidentally on his own reflection in the mirror. He saw the fatigue in his eyes, and with it, pain, anger, and fear. This can't go on, he thought, clenching his hands into fists. He couldn't stay silent and endure any longer. He knew that fighting silently means losing before the battle even begins. Sitting alone on the edge of the bed, Marcus began to remember his childhood. He saw himself as a little boy, hungrily reading medical books, dreaming of becoming a doctor. He was the first in his family to seriously consider higher education. But every day was a struggle, not only with an education system that regularly underestimated him, but also with those around him who believed he wasn't even worthy of dreaming of such a future. "You're too black to be a doctor," one classmate had once said to him. Those words cut into his consciousness, becoming the constant backdrop for every achievement, every award, every new step toward his goal. Even when he became one of the top students in medical school, the anxiety remained. It was as if one wrong move, one slip-up, and everything he had built would come crashing down. Now, after the incident with the police shook him to his core, he realized that his old fears hadn't gone away. Every instance of discrimination, every scornful look and mistrust had built on this foundation. Memories intertwined with the present, and Marcus suddenly understood that even now, as a world-class surgeon, he was still that boy made to feel like nobody. Reflecting on his past, Marcus increasingly realized that his current feelings were the result of deeply rooted prejudices that had followed him all his life. His colleagues, with whom he had been friends, now, after the incident, kept their distance, fearing to get involved in a scandal. Their coldness felt like betrayal. They, like many, preferred to step aside rather than support. Silence makes them just as guilty as those who accuse, Marcus thought, and his resolve to fight for the truth grew stronger. By evening, Marcus received a call from his longtime friend, James, who had known him since school and always supported him, no matter how tough things got. The conversation was warm, but behind the friendly words, Marcus could sense that James was worried. He had already heard about the scandal and what had happened. "Marcus, you can't just let this go." James's voice was firm. "This wasn't just an incident. It's a symptom of a problem. You deserve better." "I know," Marcus replied, feeling his heart fill with anger again. "But what can I do? They'll just apologize and move on. But no one's talking about the root of the problem. No one's discussing why this happened in the first place." James paused for a moment, then said, "You've always been a fighter. Remember in school how you stood up for yourself and others? Now isn't the time to be silent. You're not alone. You don't have to fight this alone." Those words ignited a fire within Marcus. He had always taken pride in fighting for justice, but now he realized that his silence was only perpetuating injustice. He could no longer be a passive observer in a world where his success meant nothing in the face of racism. "You're right, James," Marcus said, his voice growing firmer. "I can't let this pass. I'll start speaking up, and I won't stop until something changes." The conversation with his friend gave him resolve. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but silence was no longer an option. Marcus began planning a campaign against systemic racial bias in law enforcement. He needed to use his reputation and connections to show the public that this wasn't a random incident, but part of a deeply ingrained problem. He was preparing for a long and difficult fight, but for the first time in a long time, he felt stronger. He realized it was his duty, not just as a doctor, but as a person who couldn't stand for injustice. Marcus had made his decision. He would no longer be silent. Marcus stood backstage at the conference hall, preparing for his presentation. He felt a growing tension in his chest, but it wasn't just anticipation for a scientific lecture. It was something more. Today's presentation was supposed to be a turning point, not only for his career, but for the fight he was about to begin. He stood, holding a tablet with his notes, but his thoughts were far from the dry data and graphs. Last night was spent in sleepless reflection. He had been trying to decide whether to bring up his detention at a conference dedicated to medicine. Many of his colleagues had warned him that it could damage his reputation, that people wouldn't want to hear about racial discrimination when it came to saving lives. But Marcus couldn't remain silent. Inside, something was boiling, a sense of injustice and anger for all the years of silent oppression. He knew that if he didn't speak up now, this pain would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I'm here not only as a doctor, but as a person who lives in a society where race matters," he thought. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. He knew this could be a turning point in his life, that he would face criticism, judgment, and perhaps isolation. But he was ready. When his name was announced, Marcus stepped onto the stage. The hall, filled with representatives of global medicine, waited attentively. He glanced at the audience and began to speak, following his plan. The presentation on new methods in cardiac surgery went smoothly, as expected. But somewhere in the middle of the speech, his voice became quieter. He set the tablet aside and looked at the people in front of him, feeling that the moment of truth was approaching. "Before I finish," he began, "I need to say something important. This is not only about me, but about many others." The hall froze in anticipation. Marcus paused. The silence in the room was so thick it could be felt physically. He sensed dozens of eyes staring at him, waiting for him to continue. Marcus knew that at this moment he was risking his reputation. But if not now, when? Yesterday, after leaving this very hall, he continued, I was detained by the police. Detained simply because I am black. In this hall, you know me as Dr. Marcus Davis. But on the street, I was just a man with dark skin, a suspect by default. The words pierced through the hall like a knife. Marcus saw how the faces in the audience changed, from surprise to confusion, from sympathy to irritation. Some clearly tensed up, others lowered their eyes, but Marcus continued. There was no longer any fear or doubt in his words. I can't stay silent about what happens to people whose lives are reduced to prejudice, even when they reach the heights of their profession. I'm here to present medical breakthroughs, but I also need to talk about the system that discriminates against people based on their skin color, regardless of their achievements. His voice grew louder and more confident. He felt a wave of tension and emotion rise. Colleagues sitting in the front row exchanged glances. Some were clearly uncomfortable, others looked at him with support. But Marcus couldn't stop. Inside him, a determination to speak burned despite the pressure. We, as doctors, save lives, he continued. But what do we do when the system itself destroys lives because of skin color? How can we remain silent when we see this happening every day? A murmur began to spread through the hall. He could feel that the audience was divided. Some supported him, while others were clearly outraged that he had politicized the event. But that didn't matter. Marcus kept talking, and his words began to resonate with those who couldn't ignore the problem. After his speech, the hall erupted. Some applauded, while others sat in awkward silence, unsure how to react. Marcus felt that he had made the right move, but now he had to face the consequences. As he approached the edge of the stage, he saw journalists coming toward him. Dr. Davis, we'd like to speak with you about your presentation, said a reporter with a microphone. What steps do you think need to be taken to change the situation? Marcus nodded slowly, realizing that this was his chance to get his message across to millions of people. He was offered a television interview, and he accepted. This was exactly what he needed, a platform where his words could be heard not only by his colleagues, but by society as a whole. The next day, he appeared on a national television program. When the host asked why he chose to share his story at a medical conference, Marcus replied, "We can't separate professional achievements from social injustice. My job as a doctor is to save lives, but as a human being, I can't close my eyes to the fact that race affects our reality. We must speak up about these issues, even if it makes some people uncomfortable." His words reached millions of people. While many supported him, there were also those who sharply criticized him for bringing politics into medicine. But Marcus knew that the truth had to be spoken, even if it caused discomfort. When he returned to his hotel room, tired but satisfied, his phone was buzzing with messages. Colleagues, patients, and even strangers sent words of support. He felt that he had started something important, a campaign that would draw attention to racial injustice in law enforcement and beyond. Marcus understood that this path would be long and difficult, but he was ready to continue the fight. The truth, however painful, had to be heard. Marcus sat in his office after a long day when his phone lit up with a new message. It was one of those short, cold notifications he had been receiving more and more frequently. A colleague wrote that they couldn't attend the scheduled meeting. "Sorry, too much work. Let's reschedule," the message said, ending the conversation just like many others had in recent days. Marcus had noticed that at work, people had started interacting with him differently. Colleagues no longer lingered near him, avoided personal conversations, and sometimes outright avoided him. His words at the conference, his revelation about being detained, and the issue of racism in the medical community seemed to have alienated people. He felt isolated. Those who had once supported his research now saw him as a threat to their professional careers. Everyone understood that raising such issues could attract unwanted attention, not only from the public, but also from influential medical institutions. Marcus sighed deeply. He kept returning to the moment when he stood on the stage and decided to speak the truth. At the time, it had seemed like the right step. He knew that silence equated to supporting injustice. But now, facing clear alienation from his colleagues, he began to doubt. Had his speech at the conference been too harsh? Could he have conveyed his thoughts more softly? An internal conflict burned inside him. He was torn between his principles and a sense of guilt for the strained relationships with his colleagues. At that moment, the door to his office opened slightly, and in the doorway appeared Dr. Williams, one of the senior doctors at the hospital. His face looked tense, and Marcus sensed that this conversation would be difficult. "Marcus," Williams began, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "We all understand what happened, and I support you, to some extent. But you have to understand that such outspoken statements can harm not only you, but all of us." Marcus clenched his teeth. His thoughts were swirling, and he knew that this conversation was just the continuation of the pressure he had felt since his speech. "You have to be more careful," Williams continued, sitting across from Marcus. "You know how it is in our system. It's a system where every step on the edge could be your last. I understand your feelings, but maybe it's time to tone things down a bit." Marcus remained silent, trying to grasp the full meaning of what was being said. Williams, an older and experienced doctor who had always seemed like a strong advocate for justice, was now advising him to stay quiet. Inside, Marcus felt everything flip upside down. It felt like betrayal, even though Williams was speaking with concern. But concern for what? His career? His reputation? Or for the real fight for justice? "Are you saying I should just forget about this?" Marcus asked quietly, but with clear indignation. Williams sighed, as if he had anticipated this response. "No, Marcus, that's not what I'm saying," he replied, avoiding Marcus's gaze. "I want you to think about your career, about your family. Yes, the system is flawed, and I agree with you. But maybe now isn't the time. You could lose everything you've worked for." Marcus felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. Now isn't the time? When would be the right time? He knew Williams was speaking about personal safety, but silence had never been an option for him. He had fought against racial prejudice his entire life, and now, at the peak of his success, when he had the chance to change something, he had to keep fighting. "And don't you think that silence means consent?" Marcus asked, his voice firm but tinged with sadness. Dr. Williams shook his head. "Not always, Marcus. Sometimes it's just a strategy for survival." Those words echoed in Marcus's mind. He saw how his colleagues chose survival at the expense of their beliefs. But he couldn't do that. His values and his belief in justice stood above everything for him. This was his internal compass, his calling. He knew that the price could be high, but for him, it was the only right choice. After Williams left, Marcus sat in silence for a long time, processing everything that had happened. He understood that every time he went against the system, he risked his career. He faced a battle, not only with external manifestations of racism, but also with his own fears. He knew that his colleagues wouldn't openly support him. It was a painful lesson, but one he had to accept. Marcus stood up from his chair, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. New York, full of people, opportunities, and problems. He returned to his thoughts, realizing that he now faced the most important choice: continue the fight or stop. At that moment, Marcus's phone vibrated again. It was a message from James, his friend and activist, with whom he had been meaning to reconnect. The text was short, but full of meaning. "If you're ready to fight, I'm with you. We can assemble a team." Marcus looked at the phone screen, then back at the city outside the window. He realized that loneliness was a temporary phenomenon, that there were people who would support him on this path. He sighed, but now there was no heaviness in his chest. He had made his decision. "Yes," he said to himself, "I can't betray my beliefs. It will be a fight, but I'm ready." He began gathering a team of lawyers, activists, and those who shared his views. Marcus knew this battle would be long, but it was a fight for the truth, for justice, for a future where people aren't judged by the color of their skin. The night was quiet, but the silence brought no peace to Marcus. He sat on the couch in his living room, holding his phone and rereading the threats that had been pouring in one after another on social media. Each message was filled with hate and malice from people he had never met. The threats were becoming more real and frightening, and each new message made his heart clench. "You'll regret ever starting this campaign," one message read. "We know where you live. Your family won't be safe," read another. Marcus felt his inner world crumbling. The fear for his safety and the safety of his family was gradually taking over. He had always thought of himself as strong, but a threat directed at his children, his wife, was unbearable. He knew that his campaign against systemic racism had stirred strong emotions in society, but he wasn't prepared for such hatred. "Are you okay?" a quiet voice asked behind him. It was Sarah, his wife, who had cautiously approached him. Marcus looked up, and their eyes met with mutual concern. He could see that fear gripped her as much as it did him. "I don't know," he finally replied, setting the phone down on the table. "I don't know if we can handle this." Sarah sat down next to him and took his hand. "I believe in you, Marcus, but I'm scared for the kids. What if they do something serious?" Those words hit Marcus harder than all the threats he had read. He had always considered himself the protector of his family, but now he felt powerless to shield them from the danger his actions had brought. "I'm scared too," he said quietly, squeezing his wife's hand. "But if I stop now, if I give in, everything I've fought for will lose its meaning." The next day, the situation only worsened. The police began patrolling their home, but Marcus doubted they could truly protect his family from the threats. He understood that some of those now guarding him might harbor the same prejudices as those sending the threats. The paradox of the situation was obvious. The system he was fighting against was now supposed to protect him. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, watching his children play in the yard under the watchful eyes of the police. Each laugh, every movement brought mixed feelings: joy that they were still unaware of the danger, and anxiety for their future. "Maybe we should leave for a while," Sarah suggested, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "I know you don't want to back down, but it's not just your life, it's our lives." Marcus was silent, contemplating her words. Deep down, he knew Sarah was right. Each new threat made the situation more dangerous. He felt fear rising within him, but on the other hand, he knew that if he retreated now, his campaign, his voice would simply vanish. His fight might lose its meaning, and injustice would continue to be a part of life. "I understand," he answered quietly, "but we can't just run away. If we run now, if I stop fighting, we'll only prove them right. They want to scare us into silence, but I can't let that happen." Sarah looked at him with worry, her eyes filled with tears. She could see how this fight was changing her husband, how fear and pressure were taking their toll on him. But she also understood that to retreat would mean betraying himself. "You've always been strong, Marcus, but I'm afraid you're overestimating your strength. We have to think not only about your campaign, but about us." Marcus nodded, but deep inside, he knew there was no other choice. He couldn't give up. Later that evening, Marcus returned home after another meeting with lawyers. Inside, a storm of emotions raged. He had just signed documents making him the lead initiator of a lawsuit against discriminatory practices in law enforcement. He knew that now even more people would be watching him, both supporters and opponents. As he approached his car in the parking lot, he noticed something was wrong. The side windows had been smashed, and the word "traitor" was spray-painted in red on the hood. Inside the car, shards of glass lay scattered, and Marcus felt his heart slow down. This was no longer just a threat. It was a sign that the danger had become real. He looked around, but saw no one. A wave of panic rose inside him. If they had gotten to his car, what would come next? He sat down on the curb next to the damaged car, feeling fear take hold of every nerve in his body. "They won't stop," flashed through his mind. He had always understood that the fight for justice required sacrifices. But was he ready to sacrifice his life? Was he ready to expose his family to even greater danger? A few minutes later, as the police arrived to inspect the car, Marcus already knew that this was a moment that would change his decision. Fear filled his mind, but at the same time came the realization that if he gave up, all the threats, all the attacks would be seen as a victory for those who wanted to silence him. As the officers examined the car, he stood up, feeling something new inside. He was no longer the Marcus who was ready to give up. Inside him, determination had solidified. "I won't stop," he said aloud, more to himself, but with absolute certainty. "They won't silence me." This incident, this attack, only strengthened his resolve. Fear was a natural reaction to a threat, but true courage was to keep fighting despite the fear. Marcus sat at his desk in his office, surrounded by folders and notes he had been gathering over the past few months. There was a sense of change in the air, but with it also came tension. After the attack on his car, he realized that the fight for equality wouldn't be easy, but fear no longer held him captive. Now, determination and the understanding that he wasn't alone guided him. On his computer screen were the names of people he had brought into his cause. Among them were doctors, activists, lawyers. All of them shared his views and understood that the fight against systemic racism in healthcare couldn't remain just a conversation. He recalled his recent conversation with James, his activist friend, who had suggested gathering a team to organize a forum on healthcare equality. The idea of the forum ignited a spark in Marcus. He felt that this could be the step that not only drew attention to the problem, but created a space for constructive dialogue. "This is more than just a forum," he thought as he typed a message for the mailing list. "This is the beginning of a movement." Sarah entered the office, stopping at the door. "How are you?" she asked gently, peeking over his shoulder. "I'm gathering a team for the forum," Marcus replied, smiling at her. "Doctors, lawyers, activists, people from different fields. Everyone's ready to support it." Sarah smiled back, but her eyes still reflected worry. "I'm proud of you, Marcus," she said. "But you know this won't be easy. A lot of people won't like that you're raising these issues again." "I know," Marcus nodded. "But we can't stay silent any longer. We all deserve equality, and someone has to start this conversation." When the forum was announced, it quickly became clear that the support wouldn't be as widespread as Marcus had hoped. Many sponsors, who had initially shown interest, suddenly began backing out. They were afraid that participating in an event focused on racial equality in healthcare might provoke public backlash and negative attention. Some even called it too political. Marcus sat in a meeting with a group of doctors and activists who were helping him organize the event. The atmosphere in the room was tense, as everyone knew that without sponsorship, it would be difficult to hold the forum at a high level. "They don't want to get involved," one activist, named Anna, said with frustration, "as if equality is some kind of dangerous idea." "It's not just fear," Marcus replied. "It's systemic resistance. People don't want change because they're comfortable living in the world as it is." Everyone fell silent, contemplating his words. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. But despite that, a sense of the need to continue was growing inside him. He knew that if they gave up now, all their efforts would be in vain. There was too much injustice around, and he had to take the first step to change the system. "We'll find a way," Marcus finally said, standing up. "Even if we have to do without major sponsors, we'll still hold this forum. We'll find people who will support us, even if they're afraid to speak out openly." Anna smiled, and Marcus saw support in the eyes of everyone sitting at the table. This was the moment when fear began to give way to determination. The forum took place a few weeks later, and despite all the obstacles, it was a success. Marcus stood on stage, looking out at the filled hall. People had come to hear stories of racism and discrimination in healthcare, to discuss ways to bring about change. It was more than just an event. It was the start of a new chapter in his fight. The first speaker on stage was an immigrant doctor from India who shared his experience of discrimination during the hiring process. Then, lawyers and activists took the stage, discussing laws that impacted racial discrimination in medicine. Doctors of various ethnic backgrounds shared their struggles and offered solutions to improve the system so that everyone could receive quality care, regardless of skin color. Marcus felt his heart fill with pride and relief. Despite the threats, the pressure, and the resistance, they had managed to bring together people willing to speak openly about the issues. Several media outlets also took notice of the event, and news articles were already appearing, discussing the need for reform. After the forum concluded, Marcus stayed in the hall once everyone had left. He gazed at the empty stage, realizing that this was only the beginning. There was a long fight ahead, but the first step had been taken. Now he knew that he had support, that people were willing to fight for truth and equality. "That was incredible, Marcus," came a voice from behind him. It was James who had approached, holding a folder with materials. "You did the impossible. Now they'll definitely hear us." Marcus smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "We've only just begun, James," he replied. "But now I'm sure we're on the right path." Marcus sat in his office, staring out the window, but his thoughts were far from the outside world. Over and over, a scene replayed in his mind that he couldn't shake. Thomas, his longtime friend and colleague, stood before him with a bitter smile, saying he'd been fired. "After I supported you at the forum, they decided I wasn't a good fit anymore," Thomas had said, his voice quiet but firm. Marcus felt a chill spread through his body. He couldn't escape the guilt, as if his actions had directly led to Thomas's career being ruined. His colleague and friend, who had always stood by him, had lost his job simply for siding with him. The blow hit Marcus harder than expected. He had always known that fighting for truth came with risks, but he hadn't been prepared for close ones to suffer because of his fight. A storm raged inside him. He couldn't accept the fact that his campaign for justice and equality had led to such consequences. It seemed that every step forward came with losses that left deep wounds. Marcus recalled Sarah's words. "You have to think not just about yourself. and now he felt indebted to Thomas for everything he had sacrificed. "I put him in the line of fire," Marcus muttered, rubbing his temples. At that moment his phone vibrated on the desk, but he wasn't ready to answer. He feared hearing more bad news. Several days had passed since Thomas told Marcus about his dismissal, but Marcus still couldn't find peace. He avoided meeting colleagues, buried himself in work, but his thoughts always returned to Thomas. Every time he tried to distance himself from it, a voice in his head reminded him, "It's your fault. He lost his job because of you." The inner conflict intensified with each passing day, and Marcus couldn't find a way out of this state. He began doubting whether his path was the right one. Was it worth dragging others into this fight, especially those who weren't prepared for such sacrifices? Marcus understood that Thomas wasn't the only one who might suffer. Anyone who stood by him was at risk, but did he have the right to make such decisions for them? One evening, Sarah approached him while he sat in the living room, staring at reports he hadn't been able to finish for days. "Marcus, you need to talk to someone," she said gently, sitting beside him. "I can see how this is tearing you apart. You can't carry all the guilt for what's happening." "But how can I not feel guilty?" Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with pain and doubt. "Thomas lost his job because of me. He supported me because he believed in me, and now he has nothing. He supported you because he believed in the truth, not just in you," Sarah said firmly. "You didn't force him to take that step. He made that decision himself, because he, too, was fighting for justice." Marcus remained silent, trying to process her words. Deep down, he knew Sarah was right, but the guilt lingered like a shadow that followed him. He couldn't simply forget that his actions had led to such consequences. The next day, Marcus was on the verge of stopping his entire campaign. He seriously considered stepping back to avoid putting his colleagues and friends at further risk. But his thoughts were interrupted by an unexpected call. It was Thomas. Marcus immediately felt tense. He didn't know what to expect from this conversation. Maybe Thomas would blame him for his life falling apart, or worse, end their friendship altogether. "Thomas," Marcus said, picking up the phone. I wanted to talk to you. I'm sorry for everything that happened." But Thomas interrupted him, and his voice was surprisingly calm. "Marcus, there's no need to apologize. It's not your fault. I knew what I was getting into when I decided to support you." Marcus was taken aback. He hadn't expected those words. "But you lost your job," Marcus said, trying to process what he was hearing. "I didn't want anyone to suffer because of my fight. And that's okay," Thomas responded firmly. "I lost my job, but I didn't lose myself. I did what I believed was right. Thanks to you, I was able to speak up about things that had been bothering me for a long time. And, I don't regret a thing. Some things are more important than a career, and this is one of them." Those words seemed to free Marcus from the weight that had been pressing down on him for days. He realized that the people who supported him didn't do it for him alone. They did it because they, too, believed in the truth. Thomas gave him the strength to move forward. "Thank you, Thomas," Marcus finally said, his voice shaking with gratitude. "You have no idea how much this means to me." When the conversation ended, Marcus sat in silence, feeling a renewed sense of determination. He understood that the fight would continue, and it would be difficult. But now he knew that he wasn't the only one willing to see it through to the end. He was supported by people who believed in the cause he was fighting for. Marcus stood at his desk, holding an envelope he had just received in the mail. It was the official response to his petition to review police protocols regarding race-based detentions. He tore open the envelope, read the first lines, and felt disappointment boil in his chest. The request had been denied. There were no specific explanations, no arguments, just a bureaucratic no. He tossed the paper onto his desk, feeling a wave of anger wash over him. He knew that fighting the system would always be difficult, but he had naively hoped that an open petition backed by data and public opinion would resonate with the authorities. But all he encountered was a closed, deaf wall, unwilling to change the entrenched system. Marcus's thoughts drifted between anger and frustration. Every time it seemed like he was making progress, a new obstacle arose. How long will this go on? He thought, feeling powerless in the face of a system that refused to acknowledge its mistakes. "Did you get the answer?" Sarah's voice broke the silence as she entered the room. "Yes, and as you might guess, it's a no," Marcus muttered, crossing his arms. "They don't even bother explaining, just a refusal." Sarah walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You knew this wouldn't be easy, but that doesn't mean you should give up, Marcus. You've done too much to stop now." Marcus looked at her gratefully, but inside, the storm continued to rage. He knew Sarah was right, but the feelings of injustice and helplessness held him captive. Before him stood an entire system, unwilling to admit its faults, and he couldn't believe that even with public support, the fight was this hard. The next day, Marcus sat with his team during a meeting with lawyers and activists. The police response he had received was the central topic of discussion. Everyone in the room was outraged, but unfortunately, this wasn't new to those who had been fighting for social change for a long time. "They're just burying the issue," said one of the lawyers sitting across from Marcus. "The authorities don't want to take responsibility, and they're counting on us getting tired. It's a standard tactic." Marcus listened, his anger slowly transforming into resolve. He understood that the system was built not only on violence, but on silence. Silence from officials, police, and politicians. Each of them avoided accountability, hoping the wave of outrage would subside and protests would fade on their own. "We have to make them speak," Marcus said firmly. "If they won't respond to our petitions, we'll take it further. We'll bring this to the public's attention. People need to know the truth." "And how will we do that?" asked Anna, an activist sitting to his right. "We'll hold a press conference," Marcus said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll release data on all the unjust detentions that have taken place over the years. Let the public see what's happening. We need to take this to a level they can't ignore." The room filled with nods of approval. It was a bold move, and everyone understood that such actions could lead to even greater pressure from the authorities. But each of them realized that fighting for the truth meant going all the way. "I'm in," James said, his gaze fixed on Marcus. "We'll do it. We'll make them answer." The press conference was scheduled for a few weeks later. During that time, Marcus's team gathered data, prepared reports, and verified every instance of unjust detention based on racial bias. Each document was proof that systemic racism existed, and each case was a blow to a system that refused to acknowledge its mistakes. When the day of the press conference arrived, Marcus stood backstage, watching as journalists filled the hall. He felt nervous, but he also understood that this moment could change the course of his campaign. If they could generate public outcry, the authorities wouldn't be able to continue ignoring the issue. "Are you ready?" James asked, standing next to him. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. He knew he was ready. This was the moment he had been working toward for months. When he stepped onto the stage, the room was filled with cameras and microphones. He began his speech with a brief overview of his campaign, but quickly got to the point. "Today, I'm presenting data that has been hidden for many years," Marcus said, pointing to the screen behind him, where charts and figures were displayed. "These are thousands of cases of unjust detentions based solely on racial profiling. These are people who have suffered because of their race, despite committing no crimes. The room fell silent. Marcus could see the journalists intently following his every word, taking notes and recording video. He knew that this moment could be a turning point for his campaign. "We can no longer remain silent," he continued. "The system must change, and we will not stop until we achieve justice." When the press conference ended, Marcus felt exhausted but satisfied. He knew they had taken an important step. His team received several media inquiries, and the story began to spread. The pressure on the authorities was growing, and now they couldn't simply brush the issue aside. Marcus sat in his office when his phone buzzed with another notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. The usual story didn't catch his attention at first, but as he began reading, his heart sank. "I was detained while walking to work. The reason, my skin color. No one listened to me. They already knew who I was to them." This was one of many emails he had received since his press conference. He felt the depth of pain and despair of those who had gone through similar ordeals. These stories weren't rare. They were part of a systemic racism that haunted and ruined lives. Reading such emails had become a daily routine for Marcus. Some stories resembled his own experiences, while others revealed even more shocking instances of injustice. Marcus felt his resolve rise once again. He saw that his fight had gone beyond his personal experience. Now it involved all those people whose voices had long gone unheard. But now they were writing to him. They trusted him with their stories. It was a tremendous responsibility. "They need to be heard," Marcus quietly said, staring at the computer screen, where email after email opened one after the other. He was torn between emotions, anger at the injustice, but also gratitude that people were finally speaking up. Now he knew that their support had become an important weapon in his fight. Marcus realized that he couldn't leave these letters unanswered. One day, Marcus sat with his team, pondering how they could use the flood of stories they were receiving from people across the country. Every day, new letters came in, and there were now too many to just store in the inbox. "We need to find a way to make these stories heard," he told his colleagues. "People shouldn't be left in the shadows. Their experiences must become part of our fight." Anna, one of the activists, agreed. "You're right," she replied. "These stories are evidence of systemic injustice. People can't ignore such testimonies when they are presented collectively." That's when Marcus had the idea to create a platform where anyone could share their story. He knew they needed to create a space where people could share their experiences without fear or shame. It had to become the voice of those who had long been ignored. "We'll create an online platform," Marcus said, rising from his chair. "People will be able to share their stories, and we'll make sure they're heard. The more people who tell what they've been through, the harder it will be for the system to deny its mistakes." His team supported the idea. Creating such a platform took time, but Marcus knew it was worth the effort. This was a new step in his fight, a step toward giving people a voice and making their stories an integral part of the movement for justice. The platform went live a few weeks later. People from different parts of the country, and even the world, began sharing their stories of racism and injustice. Every day, the number of stories grew, and each one was a testament to the fact that the problem extended far beyond local communities. Marcus watched as new messages appeared on the screen every minute. People wrote about workplace discrimination, unjust detentions, and biased looks. But most importantly, they had begun to speak. This collective voice was becoming louder and louder. One day, a journalist from an international news agency reached out to Marcus. She was struck by the number and depth of the stories collected on the platform. It was a moment when Marcus's fight for justice became not just a national issue, but a global one. Your project has attracted attention worldwide, the journalist said during an interview. This isn't just an American problem, it's a global issue of racism and social injustice. Marcus felt his heart fill with pride and determination. He knew there was still much work to be done, but the first step had been taken. The stories of ordinary people had become the weapon breaking through the walls of silence. Now the authorities couldn't simply ignore the problem. I knew these stories were important, Marcus said. These aren't just the voices of victims. They're proof that the system needs to change, and we won't stop until we achieve justice. As the platform began to attract international media attention, Marcus realized his fight had reached a new level. He was no longer alone. Behind him stood thousands of people who were no longer afraid to speak up about what they had endured. It had become a true movement for justice. Marcus sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen as news stories popped up, one after another. In recent days, false rumors about his campaign and himself had begun spreading rapidly across the media. Headlines were filled with accusations that his actions were allegedly aimed at destabilizing society, that he was receiving money from external sponsors seeking to destroy established values. Marcus felt a mixture of anger and despair rise inside him. He knew that the fight against racism had always been tough, but he hadn't expected that people would try to discredit him with lies and manipulations. Marcus's thoughts swirled from disappointment to the realization that the truth had become a casualty in this battle. The politicians he had been opposing didn't want to admit their complicity in upholding a racist system, and now they were using the dirtiest tactics to silence him. "They think they can stop me," Marcus whispered, clenching his fists. "But they don't understand that this only strengthens my resolve." There was a knock on the door. Sarah entered the office, seeing the anger consuming Marcus. "I saw the news," she said quietly, stepping closer. "I know how you feel, but don't let them break you." "It's not fair," Marcus blurted out. "They're turning me into a villain, accusing me of things I didn't do. This isn't a fight for truth anymore. It's a war over who controls the truth." Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder and looked him in the eyes. "They're afraid," she said. "Your campaign is gaining momentum, and they don't know how to deal with it, other than to lie. But you know the truth, and we know the truth." Her words calmed Marcus slightly. He knew he had to keep fighting, but now he had to protect not only his reputation, but also the truth for which he had started this battle. The next day, Marcus met with his legal team to discuss the situation. The false accusations and slander being spread online and on television were starting to affect his campaign. Public support was still strong, but Marcus knew that if they didn't stop the wave of disinformation, it could damage both his reputation and the entire fight for justice. "We need to take steps to protect you and your campaign," one of the lawyers said, flipping through printouts of defamatory articles. "These rumors have already crossed the line. This isn't just talk. This is an attempt to destroy you and discredit all your work." Marcus sat, listening to the discussion, feeling as though he was on a battlefield. His fight for justice had gone beyond an advocacy campaign. It was now a legal war for his honor. "How far can they go?" Marcus asked, looking at his lawyers. "They've already gone too far," answered a lawyer named David. "But we can file a defamation lawsuit against those who spread false information. This will set a precedent and force them to act more cautiously. We need to show that you're not just fighting for the truth. You're ready to defend yourself and your allies." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding, but he knew it was the right step. He had to protect not only himself, but also those who believed in his work. He realized that he couldn't allow his enemies to silence him through lies and disinformation. "I agree," Marcus finally said. "File the lawsuit, If they want a war, we'll fight." The lawyers exchanged approving glances. They knew this would be a long battle, but their confidence bolstered Marcus's faith that he wasn't alone. He understood that fighting for the truth required not only moral strength, but also legal protection. A few weeks after the lawsuit was filed, defamatory publications slowly began disappearing from news portals. However, the damage caused by the information attack was significant. Marcus knew that despite the legal defense, it would take time to restore his reputation in the eyes of those who had fallen under the influence of false rumors. Nevertheless, thanks to the support of human rights organizations and media outlets that had taken notice of his lawsuit, the truth began to break through the veil of lies. Marcus and his team organized a new press conference where they detailed the defamatory campaigns and presented evidence of their dishonesty. "In recent months, dirty tactics have been used against my campaign," Marcus said, looking out at the room full of journalists. "Lies and manipulations have become the tools of those who don't want the truth about racism in law enforcement to be known. But the truth needs protection, and we are ready to defend it. We will no longer let lies control our story." Journalists recorded his every word, and Marcus felt that this was the moment he was taking back control of his narrative. His legal team, human rights advocates, and the media were ready to support him, and people continued sharing their stories on the platform he had created earlier. When the press conference ended, Marcus felt a sense of relief. He knew his fight wasn't over, but now he was confident that the truth, despite all the attacks, would survive and prevail. "This was an important step," James, one of his closest allies, said to him. "We showed them that they can't break us." "And they won't be able to lie anymore," Marcus replied firmly, looking toward the future with renewed determination. "We won't stop. We'll make them face the truth." Marcus sat in the quiet of his office, reflecting on how many obstacles he had overcome in recent months. It seemed that the fight against the system was dragging on, with each victory followed by even stronger resistance. He knew this was inevitable. Power never surrenders its position without a fight. Suddenly, the phone rang. On the other end was James, his longtime friend and ally. "Marcus, you've got to see this. Turn on the news." Marcus quickly turned on the TV, and his attention was immediately drawn to the screen. In one of the reports, he saw a prominent politician, someone no one expected to see among his supporters, openly voicing support for the initiative to revise police protocols. This was a person who had previously remained neutral, but his words were now decisive. "We must review how our justice system works, starting with police protocols," the politician said, standing before journalists. "The campaign led by Dr. Marcus Davis is not just a public demand, it's a call for justice that we can no longer ignore." Marcus felt his heart race. Emotions surged, a mix of joy, relief, and anxiety. This was a significant event that could change the course of his campaign, but it also came with the realization that his fight had now reached an entirely new level. The support of such a politician could attract even more attention and more enemies. "This changes everything," Marcus whispered as Sarah entered the room and saw him standing in front of the screen. "I knew your efforts wouldn't go unnoticed," she smiled, though her eyes betrayed concern. She understood that their lives might change, and not necessarily for the better. A few days after the politician's statement, Marcus's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Political leaders, who had previously been difficult to even invite to a meeting, were now seeking contact with him. Marcus's assistant entered the office, holding a list of meetings with influential figures who were ready to discuss the details of the reform. "This is incredible," Anna said, sitting next to him. "Just look at who wants to meet with you. These are the same people who previously refused to even acknowledge the problem existed. Marcus glanced at the list, a look of bewilderment crossing his face. Meetings with governors, senators, and representatives of major corporations. It all seemed unreal. He realized that now he had a chance to achieve real change, but it also came with the understanding that the pressure was mounting. "I'm not sure all of these people truly want change," Marcus said, his voice heavy. "Many of them are worried about their reputations and are trying to protect their interests." Anna nodded. "You're right, Marcus. Some of them are just trying to adapt to the changes that are inevitable. But this is our chance. We can use their influence to push our ideas forward." Marcus knew that meetings with politicians were a complicated game. He understood that behind every offer could be an attempt to preserve the status quo under the guise of reform. But he couldn't pass up this opportunity. He saw before him the chance he had been dreaming of since the start of the campaign. But behind these successes lay something greater. Marcus began receiving threats. Direct and indirect, people were making it clear that his fight was threatening too many interests. Politicians who wanted to maintain control of the system, large corporations whose interests were tied to supporting the old structures. Now they all saw Marcus as a threat. Marcus felt the pressure. Every new step forward was accompanied by new dangers. "They want me to give up," Marcus said to James during one of their meetings. "But I can't retreat. We've come too far." "We knew it would be tough," James replied. "But you have to remember why you started this fight. And you're not alone. Now you have thousands of people behind you." That evening, when Marcus returned home after yet another meeting, he felt an exhaustion that wasn't just physical. It seemed that the world he was trying to change was resisting so strongly that every step forward was a struggle for survival. Behind every success, there was a new threat, and now he understood that at stake wasn't just his campaign, but his personal life as well. Sarah was waiting for him in the kitchen. She looked at him carefully, her face full of concern. "You're home late," she said, trying to smile. Marcus sat at the table, burying his head in his hands. He was worn out from the internal struggle. He felt that their family life was suffering because of his campaign. All these meetings, threats, and pressure were pulling him away from his loved ones. "I know it's getting harder," he finally said, his voice trembling. "But now I can't stop. I can't retreat when we're so close to making real change." Sarah sat down next to him, her eyes shining with tears. "I've always supported you, Marcus. But what if the price is too high? You could lose not only yourself, but also us. We're a family." Those words pierced Marcus. He understood that his fight demanded sacrifices, and now he stood before a moral dilemma: to continue the fight or preserve his family. He couldn't find an easy answer. "I don't want to lose you," Marcus said quietly. "But if I stop now, all our efforts will be in vain." Sarah squeezed his hand, and a look of determination appeared in her eyes. "We knew this wouldn't be easy," she said. "But if this is what you're willing to fight for, I'll stand by you. We have to believe that your fight will lead to a better future. For us, too." Marcus looked at her with gratitude. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but now he was certain he was willing to sacrifice much to achieve justice. Marcus stood by the window, looking out at the city slowly waking up to a new day. There was a sense of relief in the air, but with it came a strange emptiness. The police protocols he had fought for over the past months had finally been updated. New rules, including mandatory training for law enforcement officers, had been introduced. This was the moment he had dreamed of since the day he was unjustly detained simply for being a black man. But now, with victory seemingly so close, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was only part of a long journey. Emotions flooded him, from joy to a subtle sadness. He had accomplished something many had only dreamed of, yet there remained an internal conflict. Why had it taken so long? Why does the world change so slowly, even when the truth is so clear? "You should be proud of yourself," Sarah said, approaching him and gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did what seemed impossible." Marcus smiled, but his gaze remained fixed on the distance. "I am proud," he answered quietly. "But this isn't the end. This is only the beginning. We've revised the protocols, but we haven't changed the world. Injustice still lives in people's hearts." He felt that despite the changes they had achieved, the deeper problems in society remained unresolved. This was just a small victory in a long war, and he knew that the fight for equality would demand many more efforts. "This is a big step," Sarah continued, trying to encourage him. "You've inspired so many people, and even if the path is long, you've already changed its direction." Marcus nodded, acknowledging that her words were true. But much work remained, and he couldn't afford to relax. Later that day, Marcus gathered with his team and allies to celebrate their achievement. The atmosphere in the room was filled with joy and relief. People congratulated each other, raised glasses to success, and finally felt like part of something bigger. "We did it," James smiled, patting Marcus on the shoulder. "I can't believe this happened in our time." Marcus raised his glass, but his thoughts still wandered elsewhere. He looked around at his friends and colleagues who had dedicated months, even years of their lives to this fight, and felt that this moment was important, not just for him, but for each of them. "We've made a big step forward," Marcus said when the room quieted, everyone expecting his speech. "But this is only the first step. I know many of us feel relieved, but let's not forget that there's still a lot of work ahead." The room fell silent, and Marcus continued. "Changing the protocols is an important victory, but it's not the end. It's a long process, and now our job is to make sure these changes become real. We can't stop here." His words made everyone reflect. The celebratory atmosphere shifted to one of responsibility. Marcus knew their battle had only just begun, and they had to be prepared for new challenges. After his speech, Marcus stepped outside to be alone for a while. He knew that everyone standing with him now believed that change was possible, but he also understood that these changes had enemies, people who wouldn't allow them to be implemented without resistance. A few days after the celebration, Marcus was invited to speak before a large audience. It was his chance to address the people, to inspire them to keep fighting. He knew his words could change how society viewed progress. When Marcus stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Thousands of eyes were fixed on him, and he felt the weight of the moment. He knew his words needed to be honest, without the loud slogans that lose meaning. He had to speak about the reality of the fight, about how their victory was just the beginning. "We've achieved an important goal," he began, his voice steady and calm. "But this is only the first step. We've revised the protocols, changed the rules, but we haven't changed people's hearts. The fight for justice is a marathon, not a sprint." Marcus paused for a moment, letting his words sink into the audience. "Systems change slowly, and sometimes it seems endless," he continued, "but every step we take brings us closer to the goal. Every voice, every story, every action is part of the larger fight for equality, and we must not stop." His voice grew stronger. "The fight for justice is our duty, our path. And even when it seems like we can't see the end, every step forward brings us closer. We must not fear change. We must demand it." Marcus saw the faces in the room change, his words resonating deeply. He felt that this speech was not just the culmination of his fight, but the beginning of something new. He had inspired thousands of people to continue moving forward, not to stop before obstacles. When the speech ended, the room erupted in applause. Marcus stood on the stage, realizing that his words had become an important part of something much bigger. He knew that his campaign had left a mark, and now thousands of people around the world would continue the fight for justice.